Hello, and welcome to today's live reading of Weep, Woman, Weep by Maria DeBlassie, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. I am built for tears. It's in my blood. The women in my family don't know how to have a life without sorrows. If they couldn't find any, they made them. I was always finding ways to punish myself if I got too happy. I'd get excited about the paperbacks, bodice rippers mostly, that I'd buy from the used bookstore on the corner of Main Street, and if I liked the ending of one too much, I'd throw it out. Can't do with too much happiness in the house. We were not allowed the things that made us want to rise up, like sunflowers. Our mothers weren't allowed them, so we couldn't have them either. My mom used to hide her secret chocolate stash in one of the rusty tin cans she collected, always half cutting herself when she reached in for something sweet. It was like she couldn't taste the melty goodness without reminding herself that the world was full of sharp, ugly things. Suppose that's where I got it from. When I look back on things, I always remember the way she seemed to shrink with age. She had the thin bones and pale face of the Spanish, something I hadn't inherited with my tall frame and tan skin. She always looked frailer than she was somehow, like the years working at the local diner slowly ate away at her. She didn't used to be that way. I have this memory of her from when I was very young. She looked so fresh and happy, hanging the laundry up on the line, the wind whipping through her hair and kicking up her skirt as she sang her cantos. I mean, she was all sunshine and freshly washed sheets. She had this knack, too, for growing things, like she could just reach down and touch the earth and know what it needed. That was before I knew about all the bruises and heartache hidden under a buttoned up dress, before he left her with a pile of bills and loneliness and me. I didn't know my father, but I didn't like what he left behind, so I was glad I never had to look at him. All I know is one day she had me, inherited a small adobe house on a couple of acres of land next to the bosque. We were all that was left of our family, and spent the rest of her life trying to keep that roof over our heads and men from the house. I used to stay awake at night trying to figure out ways not to turn out like that. Wait, let me back up a bit so you know where all this is taking place. We lived in a semi rural small town in the middle of nowhere called Sueño. It was more like a bunch of farms and adobe homes sitting on feral acreage with a main street that held everything together. That street was framed by a few blocks of housing that tried to look like a suburb but failed miserably. So it was a main street, fake suburbs and farmland contained by the bosque, with the Rio Grande cutting through it on one side and open desert that seemed to go on forever on the other. My favorite part of all of this was the mountains just beyond the Rio Grande that turned pink and red like a schoolgirl thinking dirty thoughts when the sun rose and set each day. People were always forgetting about the town of Sueño. Of course, that probably had something to do with the fact that we were located so close to the Shadowlands, that long sweep of desert between towns and indigenous lands that just sort of folded in on itself and went on forever, its own place outside the laws of time and space. Sometimes people went out there and never came back. Sometimes they did, and you wished they hadn't. Sometimes women went to the outskirts for help, looking for La Huesera, the bone woman, to deal with their man troubles, for a price at least. That's what the old folks said when they were getting ready to spin some impossible yarn and wanted to scare us good. Me? I didn't bother myself with Shadowlands too much because I had my hands full with this whole La Llorona situation and wasn't looking to borrow trouble. La Llorona. She's the weeping woman, but I'll get to that in a bit. The closest city to us was Esperanza, which most people also forgot about unless you lived around these parts. I mean, more than they forgot that New Mexico was part of the United States, which happens more than you think, even now. Esperanza is about an hour away from Albuquerque, the biggest city in New Mexico, and about 2 hours south of Santa Fe, the capital, where rich white people go to find themselves and feel cultural. That's the rub with growing up here. We were taught to be ashamed of our heritage, and here are white people dying to be the great granddaughter of an Indian princess and the long lost child of a bruja. I went to Santa Fe once for a field trip, and the most I can remember was that it seemed to have more crosses and churches than Sueño, and that was saying something. And so many white people. I actually felt brown without trying to darken my skin in the sun or pretend to know Spanish, whereas in Sueño, I could almost pass for white. Not that I wanted to. I'd also gone to Albuquerque a time or two, but that city always felt too big for me. Esperanza, on the other hand, Felt just big enough to get lost in, but small enough to feel like you wouldn't get swallowed up. Me and Sherry always thought of it as the big city, but really it was like a big small town. Esperanza was where you went when you wanted to be forgotten by the place you came from. That was the place you went to reinvent yourself. That was the place me and Sherry had fixed on to escape this hellhole soon as we could. There. I went and got ahead of myself again and forgot that you don't know about Sherry yet. Sometimes it still hurts to think of her, but when I do, I like to recall who she was before we were taken. You might think we looked the same because we both had long black hair and brown eyes and skin that wasn't quite white, but that's where the similarities ended. I had freckled skin and was more knees and elbows than anything, with sharp features that were more striking than beautiful. Sherry, on the other hand, she was always kind of luscious. That's the only word for it. She was soft all over with a round face, wide eyes, and a big full mouth. When puberty hit, she had curves in all the right places, while I patiently waited for my chest to fill in more and tried not to be disappointed when it didn't. Even her name was luscious. Sherry. That was back when people favored white names, as if it would erase our bronze skin or at least make it lighter. Now, everyone's giving their babies indigenous and Mexican and Spanish and mixed names. Like there was never a time when we were taught to feel shame for those impure bloodlines. Me? I still remember when we were told not to spend too much time out in the sun. Didn't want our skin any darker than it already was. And nobody spoke Spanish to us because they didn't want to dirty our tongues. Of course, my mom was the radical and kept singing in Spanish, even though she refused to pass the language on to me. Anyway, me and Sherry spent most of our days avoiding La Llorona. Yeah, that was her name, the weeping woman, like I said before. Maybe you've heard of her? The Rio Grande was our stomping ground. We figured it was best to know everything about La Llorona's natural habitat, all the better to avoid her. Plus, Main Street was full of people we'd rather not see. When we got tired of the river, we walked up and down the aqueas and ditches, which could sometimes look like rivers when they were fat and full of rain. But those were dangerous too, since La Llorona used any watery highway to do her business. And when we got too scared of hanging around water all the time, especially after triple dog daring each other to stick our hands in the water and telling her to come get us, we retreated into the bosque, where the cottonwoods shielded us from her gaze. Sherry spent more time at my house or along the river because her mother was a terrible drunk, and the men she allowed in were even worse. But when she had to, she went home to a rundown adobe on a trashed half acre right before things started looking more like a formal neighborhood. Neither of us had any siblings, so we pretended like we were sisters from different misters. In all honesty, we could have been sisters from the same mister. Sherry didn't know who her dad was either, and the men in this town liked to get around. Of course, that made us easy pickings for the weeping woman. She liked us pale, silent, and ashamed of ourselves because of things we had no control over. We'd already lasted longer than most girls. That was because we stayed loud and unruly and didn't worry about the sun darkening our skin or what people said about us or our mamas. We were brave in the daylight and didn't let anyone or anything hold us down. But when the sun sank and darkness fell, our fearlessness went with it. We knew the river woman was coming for us. It was only a matter of time. So, the way the story goes, the one that gets told in schools and on chilly autumn nights, is that once there was the senorita, and she was the most beautiful woman in the town, and she knew it too. So, she wouldn't settle for anything less than a rich vaquero. One day, a cowboy just like that rode into town, and she strung him along until he was so dizzy with wanting, he married her. She enjoyed the power she had over him and loved being the hard won prize. And enjoy her he did to the fullest until she grew round with child and he lost interest. That's how it happens sometimes once you have something. Anyway, she had children and he stopped coming to her at night after the second child. Eventually, she found out that he was cheating on her. By then, many years had passed, and she was no longer the fiery beauty she once was. And all he did was laugh and laugh at her outrage. You see, he was a little mean spirited too, just like her, and enjoyed seeing her suffer in the way she made him suffer all those years ago during their courtship. Well, when she figured out that was how he really felt about her, she flew into a rage and took their children down to the Rio Grande and drowned them. If she couldn't have the love of that handsome vaquero, He was surprised too. No one could, not even their kids. According to legend, once she'd done that, she realized her horrible mistake and tried to get her children back, but by then it was too late. She roamed the riverbank, wailing for her lost children, and cried so long and hard that her tears got swept up in the river that drowned her too. To this day, she still roams that riverbank, looking for her children. You can hear her on stormy nights, weeping and wailing for all she lost. And if you're unlucky enough to catch her eye, she'll take you down into her watery grave thinking you're one of her kids. Every time I hear her cries, a shudder goes through me because I know she's looking for me. Of course, that's the story they tell, and most of it's true. Here's the part they don't tell you. The thing I'm more and more sure about with each passing year. She didn't regret drowning her kids. She regretted giving up her power to that man, and she regretted being bested by him. He was supposed to help her purify the family line, cleanse her family of tainted blood from unholy mixed unions. They would be reborn through children paler than themselves. Instead, all he brought her was more shame. The other part most people overlook is that those children were actually girls, and he stopped going to her at night because she couldn't produce a son, the only kind of child that mattered. Back then, you weren't really a woman if you couldn't bear a male heir. So she was no longer useful to him, and he discarded her, and she was left with nothing but the memory of the power she once had over the man who now pitied and despised her. La Llorona drowned her girls, not just to spite her husband, but to rid herself of two things that would grow up and be more beautiful than her and break her heart all over again when it was time for them to get married. Sherry thought she was protecting them from her fate. I thought her bitter spirit didn't want her daughters doing better than she did. Who knows which version was right? All I knew was that it wasn't safe to walk alone at night along the riverbank. Sherry. Now, she had a good name, luscious, like I said earlier, like Sherry Baby, the song, like the kind of woman who knows how to have a good time. Me, I hated my name, Mercy. It sounded like the start of one of those boring sermons we had to suffer through on Sundays, like the prim and proper pale girls we hated so much. The ones with their long, wet hair pulled back in severe buns and skin the color of bloated fish gone belly up in the river, which was what they were once she got them. Mercy. Sherry knew I hated that name, so she used it when she was irritated with me or just looking to blow off steam after one of her mama's boyfriends blew off steam on her. Sherry could make it sound like a curse or a Hail Mary, and honestly, I didn't know which was worse. When we fought, we were hot tempered girls, and I'm not going to pretend we didn't. Sherry knew just how to push my buttons. She'd pester and tease and tell me I had a name that would make me perfect for La Irona's little collection, chasing me up and down the riverbank with her sharp tongued taunts. Those would be the times I'd finally give up talking sense to her and hide in a grove of Russian olive trees where the riverbank kissed the bosque. Their silvery leaves would hug me close to soften the sting of Sherry's words, reminding me that I didn't have to be a mercy if I didn't want to. I loved her, sure, but she had a mean streak just like the next person. But when things were good, usually when one of her uncles blew town, or she was feeling fine and powerful after filching some makeup at the drugstore, she let me be a Margarita or a Josefina or anyone but Mercy. I changed my mind about them week to week, mostly because I fell in love with any name that was long and smooth on the tongue, like a passionate love affair. I would never be as cool as Sherry, but that didn't stop me from dreaming. People said she drowned her victims, but I knew the truth of it. It wasn't a drowning, it was a baptism. Then you became like the women we always made fun of, Jesus loving, self righteous prigs who called themselves Spanish, the closest thing to white they could be. When anyone could see they had the flat nose and dark skin of people who had been here longer than those colonizers. You could always tell which ones they were, too, even with their hair up. There was always a wet ring around their tight lace collars. Their eyes were forever red rimmed like they'd been crying, though they never did. That's because their hearts stopped once they were baptized, and feelings were things they left at the bottom of the river along with their souls. Those were the women who married men who cheated and raised mama's boys and little girls so full of their own virtue. They were hard and sour like lemons. Those were the women who cried when their husbands beat them and strayed, then defended them to anyone who said boo. Love was just a word in country songs, not something you actually got in life. That's men, and you were lucky if you got one who could be a good provider and sometimes drink so much they forgot to take their pain out on you. Passion, genuine affection, a relationship of equals, those were things that only existed in between the pages of the cheap books me and Sherry guiltily consumed, then cast aside like a used condom. But I wanted it to be real. So did Sherry. That's why we promised each other that we would never be like them. It was a vow we renewed every day along the river. Like if we said it often enough, we could make it true.